Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday night class. I can always count on you, Eddie, for that. I am going to take just a moment here to silence my phone, and then we will begin. Let's pray. Father, thank you again for the time that you've given us together. I pray that as we continue to study and to think, to reflect, and to discuss together this great gift that you've given to us in worship, that it would be edifying to us, that it would aid us, that it would help us as we seek to worship well to your glory and for our good. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, we are on Lesson 10 this evening. Tell Me the Old Story, Lesson 10, which is titled Angels in the Architecture, which is from a Paul Simon song, You Can Call Me Al, and I've stolen it shamelessly from a book by the same title by Douglas Wilson. So I want to talk to you tonight about an aspect of our worship that maybe doesn't get as much attention as I think it should, and that is the aspect of architecture and church buildings, and even what we might call the furniture of the sanctuary, and even where we put it. And so this is the start of that conversation. It's going to lead us very naturally into a larger conversation about the place of preaching in the worship service, which is what we'll get to not next Wednesday because we're off for that week for Thanksgiving, but the Wednesday after that is when we'll start to have that conversation together. So the opening question I have for us here is, does church architecture matter? So in the 18th and 19th centuries, many churches were built after the Gothic tradition, okay? So Gothic tradition, either that tended to be, and I'm thinking in kind of early America here, 1700s, 1800s, and then as you get into the 1800s into the 19th century, you pretty much had one of two kinds of churches. You had really big churches, often first churches, or you had just really small, simple, kind of after a Puritan model, very kind of as basic as the architecture could be. Over time, though, architectural expectations about church buildings changed. So the idea of what a church building ought to look like changed over the last, 200 years. And so I want to open with this question. I'm not looking for a particular answer. Why do you think that is? If we have built church buildings basically more or less along the same paradigm, why might that change? Okay. Okay. Sometimes it might have to do with the equipment that you have available to you. Sometimes it might just be that's what's available. So if you've got a piece of property, you want to use it as a church, maybe it wasn't built to be that way, but you can afford it, your congregation can afford it, or what have you. That's a possibility. And so then the question of does it matter is what I'm pursuing tonight. I want to talk to you about, as I said, church buildings and church furniture. Now, when people come into your house, okay, if you're having people over, I'm going to ask you a very simple question. Do they notice stuff in your house? Yes or no? Yes. And you kind of, at one level, you're kind of like, well, hopefully. They might notice the way you have things arranged. They might notice the color scheme or the way you've put things together. Or if they're like me, they're just going to notice what sort of food you've put out. Okay? And generally what you're aiming for in moments like that is to be hospitable, right? So you want to extend hospitality, you want people to be comfortable. But at the same time, in a sense, the way you organize your space can be and often is a reflection of what you value, right? So if you value, like I know some people, they really get pumped up and excited about their travel. And so there's going to be pictures of places they've traveled all over the house, for instance. Do you have any other, does anybody have any other examples of that? Like something that's around your house that when you see it, that's indicative of like what's important to you, what matters to you, a way that you've arranged a room? Artwork? Okay, artwork's a great example. Things that, and that can even be sort of conversation pieces when people come over, things that, or maybe artwork that you yourself have done. And so then obviously that's going to be even more meaningful to you, I would think. And so we already assume, we already are fine with the assumption that the way we organize our homes says a lot about what we value or what we like or what's important to us. So I want us to explore, might the same be said of churches as well? We've talked before in this class about some of the dangers of Gnosticism or Gnostic thinking. And Gnosticism could be its own, and it is its own sort of university course in different places. But one form of ancient Gnosticism tends to care only, or at least most, for the soul or the spirit, and basically reduces the body, the flesh, to, at best, a prison for the soul that you're trying to get out of, or at worst, just garbage, okay? And so the God we're given in the Scriptures is very different. This God creates the world. He doesn't call it garbage. He calls it good. And then more amazing than all that, this God enters into human flesh. And then when he's resurrected, he keeps it on, okay? And so that would have absolutely collided with ancient Gnosticism, and it did in some really interesting ways. But God told Adam and Eve to care for and to cultivate the physical world. God cares about the physical world. And we instinctively know how to do that, how to care for and to cultivate in our homes and in our workplaces even. Sometimes, though, I think we get to church and we can be tempted, so here are those qualifiers, we can be tempted to pretend like that doesn't matter as much. All that matters is the spiritual stuff, not the physical stuff. And so all I'm offering to you is that's while we might privilege the spiritual over the physical, we're not saying, it wouldn't be Christian to say that one matters and the other doesn't. So during the Reformation, the Reformers recognized that the way you construct a room and even where you put the furniture, it might not bring you closer to God, but it does preach what you value. And so what tended to happen in a lot of these churches, so you got to think Reformation, these were Roman Catholic churches that got flipped, okay? And they became Protestant churches. And one thing that became kind of common was these high altars would come down, and instead the pulpit would be moved from the side to the center. Or in, I think, one case in Geneva, actually they sort of, the pulpit was like a basket, and they hung it on the wall in the middle, so that you're in the middle of the room, and you can get the best sound for people to hear you. So if you go from having a big altar in the center of the front of your church to the pulpit, what is that communicating? Immediately, what does that communicate?
Preaching is central.
Right. Preaching is central. Preaching is what we're about. Word of God preached is what is most important. Okay? So think about this another way. Let's pretend someone gets accused of murder. If you've been watching the trial of the last week or so, you don't have to pretend for this exercise. But let's pretend someone gets accused, and let's assume they're innocent, okay? But they get accused. And let's pretend the trial is really awful. Oh yeah, that's for pulpit in the center. That's obviously a more recent picture than the Reformation. No, go back one, please. Yeah, just stay there for the moment. And so that's pulpit's in the center, and obviously you can see it's really important. It's big. Takes up a lot of the space up front. So okay, back to our courtroom. And let's say that the accused really gets put through the ringer, emotionally, mentally, psychologically. The circumstantial evidence on top of that looks really bad. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it kind of really looks like they did it. But let's assume they're innocent. And let's say that innocence is vindicated, and they walk. Okay? They're declared innocent. But man, it's close. And it's a long trial, and it's just brutal on everybody. And they cry the whole way home because they know that could have gone really bad. Now, fast forward 3 years. That same accused, declared innocent person gets a jury duty summons. No big deal, right? How's that going to feel, though? Walking into the courthouse, let's say. Walking into the courtroom. Smelling those smells again. Seeing those awful colors. I don't know if you've ever been then to the Rapides Parish Courthouse, but it's just like brutalist in terms of the painting and the colors. It's like an assault on the senses. So what's that going to do to them or for them or in them? What kind of emotions is that going to stir up? Negative. Right? Let's just say negative, right? Yeah, it's going to be a really hard go for them. So we instinctively know that with certain things in life, place, location, architecture, room matters. Okay? Surroundings matter, and rooms and smells and visuals get associated with memories, especially smells. And so, as I said, a big part of the Reformation is when churches became Protestant, what happened was not only a reformation of their theology, but renovation of their properties, okay, renovation of their churches. And they moved from what was called, many of them moved, not all of them, but within Protestantism, many of them moved, from what we call a split chancel. So a chancel is this bit at the front, and actually what we have is kind of closer to a split chancel, which is you have your pulpit on one side, okay, you have your altar or table in the middle here, and then usually where Eddie sings, what you would have is a lectern, which is different from the pulpit. And does anybody know what the difference is between the lectern and the pulpit? Okay, the pulpit is only for preaching. The lectern is for everything else, right? Whether it's singing or a scripture reading by somebody else or some kind of announcements or what have you. The pulpit is for preaching, okay? And so that's split chancel. When the pulpit is central, you would normally have the table down here where I'm standing, and you'd have the pulpit moved here to the center. Similar to that picture. Now, what does that communicate when the table moves down here, say, and the pulpit moves here? What's the communication that's happening there?
It's formal and dry.
When the table moves?
Personal. That feels very personal.
Feels impersonal, okay. The sheer relocation of the furniture, though. So if you think back to like pre-Reformation, so you've got let's just say that you've got an exalted, really high table or high altar, and when that table gets moved down a few levels, and the pulpit gets put where the table was, what's being communicated there? Right, sermon's more important, yeah, preaching of the word, but also insofar as word and sacrament are connected, preaching and table are connected, they're connected, but the table's lower.
But where was the table pre-Reformation?
Pre-Reformation would have been...
Where was the priest relative to the congregation and the table?
Right, would have been not only in the middle, but in the back here.
And the priest is in between.
Priest is in between, he's the mediator, and you're looking at his back, not his front.
And that's what changed.
Yeah, that also changed. That's a big change. Right? And so this now within a Protestant setting, you're going to have the pastor who's facing the people rather than going off and doing the hocus pocus in a corner by himself to bring it out to everybody. Okay? Yes, it's not a table, it's an altar. That is a big difference. Yes.
So are you trying to say that it looks like the preaching is superior to the table because it's higher?
Yes.
Or are you trying to say that the table is moved to be part of the people because we have access?
Oh, that's interesting. I think I would probably go with the second one. Well, it is both, in fact. The tables move closer to the people, yes. There is also just this understanding that you don't, it's kind of a, you're not obscuring the table, preaching in front of the table, where, and so if this is the visible word where Jesus makes himself visible to his people, you're not going to stand in front of it and obscure it. And so the pulpits, and so the table's down, yes, in the midst of the people, as it were. And then at the same time, it's the pulpit is higher up and kind of a more exalted position, and the idea is I mean, typically, especially within Presbyterianism, the idea has been word first, sacrament second in terms of their importance.
Are you going to talk about the elevated?
Yes, that'll be next week. That'll be next time when we get to preaching and the place of preaching in the worship service. And so, when pulpits were made to be, let's just say, grand. Go to the next one, please. Okay. Oh, yeah, so this is more of that same idea. So you see the pulpit is in the back, and that pulpit's big. This is at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Monroe, Louisiana, one of the churches in our presbytery. And so you can see that the Lord's table is there in front of the pulpit. And again, that's their chancel there. They've recently built and renovated this building. It's absolutely beautiful, and they've got a pretty impressive pulpit. And so here's the thing. When your pulpit, like this one and the one we saw before, is ginormous, right? Imposing, right? The thing looks like it just landed, yeah? What do you suppose people might be trying to communicate about preaching in that? Right. This matters. It's quite literally a big deal, right? Yeah. Okay?
I think it also points to the fact that the foundational, the imposing aspect of the word.
Yeah.
It has the right to be imposing.
And I'm starting to trample on next week's lesson a little bit, but I'm going to show you in some pictures next week that because my initial answer to that question was like, well, does it make too much of the preacher? What's interesting is that when a preacher actually gets into a pulpit that big, he looks this big. And so it actually has a diminutive effect on the preacher, interestingly enough. I'll show you some pictures to prove that.
Week after next, right?
Yeah. Week after next, right. Not next week, but week after next.
What do you think, because a number of churches now have done away with the pulpit altogether.
Yeah.
And they have something like this.
Yep.
Which to me is a lot more friendly.
Right.
The
Yes. Has I was going to say a homey feel, but we don't use them at home, so that wouldn't be right.
It makes you more
Approachable. Sure. Yes, and it, what? Feels less reverent. It's become, so the accessibility of the minister has become a really high value in churches in the last, I'd say, 50 years. There's no question about that. It's not a criticism, just an observation. And so we begin to see during the Reformation, pulpits get grand, and they move to the center of the chancel, okay? And I want to emphasize, not the stage, but the chancel. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And when you have a central pulpit, you usually have the table down in front, lower elevation. So what gets interesting is that over the course of the 1800s, American churches start to move from either a very kind of simple Puritan model or a Gothic model even, which is sort of distinctively churchy, to, go to the next slide, please, to a theater model. So the architecture of the church is actually based on the 19th century theater, is what begins to take shape. So early 19th century styles Gothic, and over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, there were two significant shifts in the architecture. One is that they started to look more like theaters, and the second one, which I have less to say about, they actually started to look like homes. So like in Birmingham, for instance, you've got Briarwood Presbyterian Church, big, glorious red brick building. Why red brick? Well, every house in Birmingham is red brick almost. And so, like, it just matches. And so if your church looks like all the houses, what then are you communicating?
Part of the community.
Yeah, part of the community. You might even be saying something about the importance of family, maybe. I don't know. And, that's a fine thing. But I'm exploring now, why is it that architecture shifted? And so if you think about early America, you'd probably have a lot of simple Puritan churches. Again, simplicity. You got pews, you got a pulpit, and maybe very little else. Maybe you've got a piano, okay? Maybe. And so what does that communicate? Just kind of a high, I don't want to, maybe austerity would be too much to say, but just, okay, simplicity is definitely your goal there. What else might be your goal? What else might your architecture be preaching? Just basic pews and a pulpit, straight, like this, okay? What are you trying to do with your building?
humility.
Oh, yeah. Humility and simplicity.
There's also like a Spartan nature.
Yeah.
Not in a negative sense, but
Right.
like we are hard.
We pinch pennies?
No, I was thinking like this is, we do what matters and nothing else.
Yes, I think that's right. And I also think there's a sense in which it's like, we're going to pack as many people in here as we can to where you can still hear the guy. Yeah, go ahead.
And it may be a reverse of the elaborate
Yes, like a pendulum swing. I think that's a good point, yes. And so I think one of the things it says is we're going to get as many people into this room as we can, so long as they can still hear what's being said. The emphasis is on the preaching. So that's why, again, elevated pulpit. And the point of an elevated pulpit, you might think, I mean, with the big grandiose pulpit I showed you a moment ago, and some of these ones I'm going to show you next week, where you literally have to walk up a staircase to get into, okay? Now, here's the thing. What does that make certain? They can hear you and they can see you. So you got line of sight on the guy, and you can see him, and probably you can hear him better. But what gets really interesting is that once you get into the latter 19th century, we begin to see these theater elements that get adopted. So pews start to change into theater seating, and then this also shifts. When I say theater, you're going to hear me blur the line between old theater and movie theater because both apply here as we get into the 20th century. Pews become theater seating. Chancels, okay, with this area behind me, become stages, okay? Pulpits become lecterns or podiums, all right? And so when churches become theaters, over time what happens is that if your church looks like a theater, it's very easy for worship to become something you watch rather than something you do, okay? It's very natural, even subconscious, that if you're in theater seating, what is it you do in a theater? When you're in a theater, what is the activity you are engaged in? Watching. What? Entertainment, yep. You're not a participant, you're a consumer, okay? What happened is church architecture began to favor the theater setting or the concert setting, is that inevitably there's going to be a sense in which you adopt the same affect of the locale. If you go to the movies, you're not a participant in the movies. If you are, people tell you to be quiet, right? He's behind the door, don't go in there, that kind of thing. If you become a participant in the movie, people ask you to leave, right? You're not a participant. You are a passive observer. Your job is to keep silent and focus on that stage or on that screen. Some venues look like concert halls, and again, in a concert hall, main purpose is to keep your mouth shut and listen. And so I would offer that, as we've talked before in here and in other places about the consumer church mentality, I would say, well, if things function like concerts and theaters, the concert mentality, or excuse me, the consumer mentality is somewhat inevitable. Yeah, Will.
Before you get too far down here.
Yep.
How much of an impact do you think it is? Obviously, you had to be concerned about acoustics.
Yes.
In, Reformation era.
Yep.
Buildings. And then when we get into the 20th century, you don't have to worry about that anymore.
Because of amplification.
Right.
So, yeah.
That really changes the way you get to build things.
It really does. That's fair enough. And so, and I've got a point later on that there are charitable slants you can put on all of these changes. And I do think that's good to include. Like I said earlier, so there's a great story I read in preparation for this, that a church started meeting in an opera house in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They started meeting in an opera house because it was all they had, right? It was the only space they could get access to. And it's like, well, okay, that's fine. And so they did. What's interesting is what they noticed over time is that the sort of people that showed up for their services are the sort of people who would show up at the opera house. They sort of had this more now refined culture that would show up to their church services, and like riffraff wouldn't show up to the church services because they didn't feel comfortable in the opera house. It's very interesting. So it is possible to do that intentionally, I suppose. I wouldn't want to accuse them of that, but yeah.
How much does economics and resources?
Right, and that I would say it's a really big deal, and if a church were to make a decision like that, so I remember of a church plant that I was a part of in Virginia. We met in the middle school gym because it's all we had. Before that, they were meeting in a funeral home. And according to the pastor, they were dying to get out of there. He made the joke every single time he told the story. And so if you walk into, or here's another example. If you walk into a church, maybe you've walked in one of these before, maybe one of these older churches, and like one of those old pipe organs takes up like the entire chancel, what does that communicate? Music's really important apparently, like really important. Because those things are really expensive to maintain, and it's hard to find somebody who knows how to play them. Yeah, so it's good to say that music is important, right? We do want to be careful, though, I think, that we're not engineering the concert environment. If you think about a concert, and this is a great example, lights are off, right? Except for stage lights, those are on. So the stage is the focus. The audience is invisible. When you come to church, you should not be invisible. Right? At a concert, they blast the music so that you can sing or not sing don't really matter. Okay? All that matters is that the music gets blasted. Now, in church, here's the thing. In a church, I'm a firm believer that the instrument should never overpower the singing. And if they do, let me know, or let him know, or let him know that we don't want to overpower the singing. So
No risk of that here.
I don't think so. You guys can usually out-sing the instruments no matter what we do, which is wonderful. Yeah, especially if Will's dad is here, yeah. Here's the point, though. In a rock concert, you are anonymous. Nobody knows you're there. Nobody would miss you if you were gone. And in a church, we shouldn't vanish. So here's the thing that's hard for sometimes to get our heads around. That like the gathered assembled worship is really about the gathered assembly. It is not 200 people in a room having their own isolated individual devotional experience, right? It is all of us together worshiping, encouraging one another. So if you go to the next one, please, Burley. Oh yeah, sorry. Passivity is the threat. What's the purpose with the stage and stuff? I think there's one more. And then focus, yeah, because I don't know how to do the three that all start with the same letter. Go ahead. All right. So Ephesians 5. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Next, please. Almost the same words here that we find in Colossians. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Okay? Do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit. Okay, so don't get drunk with wine, be filled with the Spirit. What then does it mean to be filled with the Spirit? What do Spirit-filled people do? Addressing one another, I said one another, in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your singular heart, right? So you're encouraging one another. There's all this one anothering going on when we're gathered here, encouraging each other in the singing. Because why? Because you're making melody to the Lord with your individual heart. Okay? So it's both and. So it's a room of individuals that are corporately worshiping together for the encouragement of all. So then what happens if we construct an entertainment environment, go to the next one, please, is that the worship service is no longer about encountering God in the ways He has appointed. It instead, if we are not careful, please hear these qualifiers, if we are not careful, church can become the time when we get together in order to be entertained by Christian themes. Okay? And it is what church services can become. And it can then be the expectation that Christians put on their churches. That I'm here in order to be entertained by Christian-themed stuff. And so you then start measuring it by whether or not it entertains you. So evangelical culture can become a desire for Jesus to entertain us rather than justify us, rather than sanctify us, perhaps. The benefits of Christ seem not as impressive if what we're looking for is entertainment. So we have to, in other words, we should be careful of never demanding that God sanctify us, right? Make us more like Jesus in the same way that we are entertained, right? The same way that I get my entertainment buttons pushed is the same way that God has to satisfy me in life. So here's maybe a question I'm posing just for you to think about. What if in turning some worship services into entertainment, we actually cheapen worship? What if there's a quality of worship that a lot of people don't know about because they've been blending their entertainment with their worship for so long, they don't even know that there's anything else, right? So when the church becomes about entertainment and the gathered service becomes about entertainment, then absolutely, necessarily, what the service becomes about is the satisfaction of preferences. We've talked about this before. Now again, listen, when it comes to your entertainment, you should care about your preferences. You absolutely should, okay? When you go to the movies, you should, pick movies that entertain you, right? That's fine. That's a fine thing to do. Movies exist. by and large, for entertainment. So go ahead and pick ones that entertain you. But if we classify our worship service as a provider of Jesus-themed entertainment, then we will begin to demand that our entertainment preferences be satisfied. So Carl Trueman has some reflections on this in the Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which was we did it a Wednesday night study ago. Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. So I got this quotation for you. In the hands of Nietzsche, Marx, and Darwin, you remember exploring those guys, the world loses its innate teleology. What he means, these philosophical movements of these three guys started to change people's mindset so that the world you live in doesn't have purpose, right? Nietzsche, Marx, Darwin. The world you live in does not have purpose. You don't have a purpose. You are a glob of, what's the Star Trek thing? What? Meat. Ugly bags of mostly water, right? It's from Star Trek. They meet an alien race who dubs humans, you are ugly bags of mostly water, okay? And so these philosophical movements, humanity doesn't have purpose. Humanity doesn't have, certainly not God-given purpose. And he said, these three, so Nietzsche, Marx, Darwin, effectively strip away the metaphysical foundations, that's underlying reasons, for both human identity and for morality, leaving the latter, that is morality, as Nietzsche is happy to point out, a matter of mere taste and manipulative power games. The Romantics grounded ethics in aesthetics and the cultivation of empathy and sympathy, confident that a universal shared human nature provided a firm foundation for such. In other words, let me translate that. Shifts in these philosophical movements made it so that morality was a matter of insisting on your preferences. Like, let that sink in for a second. Morality is insisting on my preferences. That's what's right. I gather up all my preferences and I demand them, okay? And so I would leave it to you as to whether or not that's had an impact on our world. Having some way, and then perhaps secondarily, having some way to explain why your preferences are superior to everybody else. As for the church, wherever you are on what you want to happen in a church service, and I understand we have probably different opinions on that, we are all vulnerable to this danger. We're prone to insisting on our preferences as a moral imperative, right? And so the thing that's driving it though is again it's what do we prefer. So I think sometimes we've come to a point where if we go to church and we get entertained, the temptation to be like, well, that was really good, right? That was really great. They did a great job. One of the things I really appreciated, Joanne Ayers came to me after a sermon recently. I think it was Reformation Sunday, and she just kind of pulled me aside and she said, I didn't like the sermon. I mean, she goes, but it was good. And so, like, she's saying, I didn't like it because she said, it felt like you called me out. She's like, so I didn't like it, but it was good. Well, okay, thank you. I'll take that for the compliment, I suppose it's meant to be. And so the temptation then is to go into places, and it could be a church, it could be anything though, but we tend to measure its goodness by whether or not our preferences were satisfied and amplified, okay? And so like a good reminder is like if worship ever makes you uncomfortable, take heart, like maybe it's supposed to. That can be a good thing. So I'm almost done with my little reflections here. When the church becomes a theater, the congregation becomes customers. And customers at the theater are, by the very nature of being customers at the theater, they're critics. So like if you go to a movie, congratulations, you're now a movie critic. And if you go talk to somebody after the movie, what are they going to ask you? Yeah, was it any good? Did you like it? What did you think of it? Right? Because you went to a movie. So that means you're now a movie critic of that movie. Okay? So, and that's the goal of the movie, to get you to like it to some extent. And when you leave, you tell people what you thought about it. Oh, I didn't really like it. Or I've heard this synopsis of some movies. It didn't make me feel anything, which for a movie is not good. Right? If you sit for 2 hours through a movie, credits roll, and you're like, I felt nothing. It's like, well, okay, probably not a very good story then. Probably not a compelling movie. If our churches become theaters, it's going to be a very easy temptation for us to judge churches the same way we judge theaters. If our churches become theaters, we begin to believe that the only way to participate is by being up front. It's a big one. That you have to be up front to participate, to be valued, to be seen, to be recognized. And that what develops then is, again, that's natural. If the audience is just a passive group of observers, then they're absolutely right. You got to be up here to be doing anything important. Okay? And that's really wrong. This is, it's not one or two guys doing worship. You guys know that. It's all of us participating and worshiping together. I mean, sometimes I just think there's a temptation. It's like, well, because there's a leader doing stuff up front, the rest of us aren't participating, which nobody says that if you go to a symphony concert, right? Nobody says, because there's a conductor leading everything, there's no symphony. There's no symphony participating. No, that's not true at all. But the problem is if our churches begin to reflect entertainment culture, then what will tend to happen is that churches and leadership, what we've seen, they tend to reflect celebrity culture. Okay, and so even the way a pastor dresses. If you want to know why a lot of pastors don't wear suits anymore, in even the most biggest churches, it's because celebrities don't wear suits anymore. Right? They don't. Now I'm going to pick on a guy who's disgraced himself, so it's okay if I pick on him, I suppose. But he's a fellow named Carl Lentz. Go to the next one. Who was a pastor at Hillsong for some time. All right. Who was way cooler than I'll ever be, but in a lot of ways imitated celebrity culture. And that was really his target, his demo. That's what he was about, and so imitation of celebrity culture then is not about wearing suits. It's about wearing designer jeans and stuff like that. And another one, it's Carl Lentz at Hillsong, and so he's not there anymore. But he was an incredible commentary on some of these dangers since he was disgraced and excused from leadership and things like that. So let me now go to some thoughts on this that I think try to help us kind of to get our hands around this. Can you go to the next one, please? Yeah. And then we'll talk about it more. So when it comes to church and theater, the question that might naturally arise is, well, doesn't this make people feel welcome, right? Isn't this maybe closer to what they're used to, say theater-style rooms and auditorium-style rooms, things like that? And you know what? That might be a noble goal. And you certainly, we've joked before, there's a difference between being maybe seeker-sensitive and seeker-hostile. You're not seeking to be hostile to people who are visiting. Paul says as much in 1 Corinthians 14. But I do tend to be skeptical of anything that's based on an attractional model. So if we do this, they will come. And so my conclusion, though, is just, number one, the way we put, say, the sanctuary together, the way we put the chancel together matters. It does communicate things. Even if we don't mean to communicate things, it communicates things. Where you put the furniture in the room preaches, and you imitate the surroundings you're in if they're familiar surroundings. Okay, and so if our models for church worship in terms of the spaces we use are based off an attractional entertainment model, we should expect that to shape the culture. Otherwise, it would take a lot of intentional work for it not to. So don't hear me say it's impossible to. That if a church is meeting together in a let's say in an old theater. I knew of such a church when I was in Virginia. They actually met in a movie theater. So am I saying that church is doomed never to be able to break out of an entertainment mindset in their structure and their worship services? No, I'm not. I'm saying they're going to have to work harder at it, though. And if they know that going in, then God bless them. They've got a fighting shot. They really do. But that our environment matters, I think probably more than we think it does, more than we tend to give it credit for. Okay? So, thoughts or questions about this? Eddie?
What do you say to the critic who says, well, the New Testament church didn't even have buildings?
Yeah, they did, though. As soon as they could, they did. That's my first answer. It just tends to be the case throughout history that when Christians keep gathering together, they start building. And my thing with church buildings is always why not? We build spaces for everything else in this world that we believe to be important. And so building a building for a something is a statement about what you think about the something, whether or not it's important.
So you're not violating the regulative principle because the Bible doesn't. I'm just trying
Yeah.
to play the advocate.
Right. Yeah. So let's dig into that a bit. So so you certainly had gathered assembly meeting in the synagogues before they were thrown out. Then it became rather difficult to meet together in the synagogue when they kick you out. Certainly, you also had what we might call house gatherings, house churches alongside that. As best I can tell, well, again, the trouble is if you want to be like, well, what are our records on the first century? Not much, y'all, beyond what we've got in Acts. We just don't have a lot. And the Didache, that's true. But it seems like whenever they could, they met together in larger groups, even in catacombs and tombs and things like that. What's the word I'm looking for there? Like crypts, and which had to be amazing, right? You're worshiping around dead people. It's like, yep, that's going to be me. And so, Lord, get me ready for that. I'm not saying we need to change our structure in here to match that, but yeah. So that's my answer to that. That it seems like as soon as they could start building, they did, and it became very clear that it's like we want this to be beautiful, and even the steeple, right? The idea of the church steeple wasn't just so it looked big and imposing. But it was also so you could see it from far off. Like if you don't have Google Maps, and so you can't get to the church that way, at least this way you can put line of sight on the place. And in fact, a great example of this is the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. Like they don't have a parking lot, right? So like you have to park a ways out and approach in on foot. And it's this massive, imposing cathedral. And like by the time you're in, you have a sense of like pilgrimage, like, oh, I'm finally here, yay. And I remember even there was a church I went to in Edinburgh. They had a service of lessons and carols around Christmas time, and you had to walk through the graveyard first to get to the front door of the church. And
Well, you talk about the regulative.
yeah,
Yes, the temple is ended,
yes,
but the design concepts
Mm.
that God put into the temple
yes,
are not necessarily
That's
gone.
true.
Beauty and
Right.
the reverence of God and
Yeah.
I'm just trying
there's no
to.
reason that's passed away.
Just trying to mess with
play
me.
the advocate of
Yeah,
this
And I was saying that.
yeah.
Annoying people who I love
Yes,
that
we love.
think
Yes.
you're outside of, you just need to do a house church and nothing else.
Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, no.
Think what?
Did you?
I want to just play the role of the people that I love in general. That we like, oh, it's just house churches. That's all the Bible tells us to do. We shouldn't have buildings or churches.
Right. Yeah.
How you deal with it.
Yeah, and I would say that can be house churches can still be a noble option. As long as it's not every house to himself, right? Every man for himself, every house to himself. As long as you still have a larger community happening together, which is harder to do if you're in pods, so to speak.
Brian?
Yeah.
Well, and a couple of things that, like, you talked about theater.
Mhm. Yes.
Theaters. There's also a whole era, which I think it maybe hopefully we're past it, churches that look like your living room.
Oh, yeah.
It's not a formal living room. It's just
Okay.
like, with the formal drapes and the cushions
Oh, right,
and
right.
everything. and
Right.
Chairs on stage.
Yeah. The comfy chairs.
comfy
Yeah.
chairs.
Comfy chairs.
Floral
Yeah.
arrangements in big
Right.
round spaces.
Right. Yeah.
Just,
Yeah.
yes, we should be
Right.
reverent.
Right.
Solemn, but solemn.
Yes.
It's a weird feeling.
Yes. I mean, I would say, so it's interesting to me that church architecture became its own thing for a while. Like there were places that were churches and they didn't look like anything else but churches. And that's, I admittedly have an affection for that because it's an idea that we've set apart this space for this purpose. And this is what we're doing. Right, instead of a basketball court. And so it's like, right, yeah. And so it's in the same breath, it's like, I think some people, they really want to stress that we really can meet with God anywhere, right? And so then things like the church plant in the middle school gym becomes a testament to that reality. And I say, fair enough. But again, in the case of the church plant, as soon as we could get a building, we did. Actually, it was an old Episcopal church that was closing down, and so we bought their building and just moved right in and rearranged some of the furniture. Yeah, Daniel.
What do you think about the Christian entertainment industry
Mm,
kind of in general? So outside of
right.
church entertainment, but also tied to that, so maybe there's a place for church entertainment, concerts and things.
Sure.
But tied to that, people whose career
Yeah.
is being, a Christian entertainer.
Yeah.
Not so much to lead worship, but to sing Christian songs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's the role of that in your mind?
Well, there's a place for it. And again, I don't know how to express this other than how I'm going to express it. So like, there was a time. Now, this was a time that was also had its own spiritual problems. So I'm not saying it's some kind of glory day era, but there was a time where if you wanted the best music, you went to church, right? So when you've got a guy like Johann Sebastian Bach, who's a committed Lutheran, writing some of the most beautiful music the world has ever heard, and it's like a lot of it's for church. And so now the church is not the imitator of an entertainment culture. Like, hey, if you like Bono, we've got, well, I guess that's a bad example. But if you like John Mellencamp, then we've got Stephen Curtis Chapman or whatever. And I like Stephen Curtis Chapman. He's fine. So it's what's happened in a lot of Christian entertainment is we become imitators rather than inventors, rather than creators. Innovators, yeah. Rather than creators, we become imitators. And it's like, well, here's something the world does. Here's the same thing with Christian words, except it's not as good. So here, like, oh, thanks. Now, I think that's changing because some people are recognizing that.
I don't know. Like, I think there's situations where I think you can have a more charitable take on it.
Yeah.
Shaolin, right?
Yeah. Those would be exceptions.
I will tell you, though,
Right.
he is taking his cues on his style from, like, Tupac.
Okay.
These early
Sure.
90s and late 80s.
Rappers and hip-hop artists, yeah.
That's who influenced him
Mm-hmm.
young.
Yeah.
But he's got doctrinally sound.
But I would imagine, like, to be fair, I would imagine most hip-hop artists would also say, like who are not believers, who would all say that those are their influences, right? Yeah.
I'm just,
So
I don't know, I guess I'm just
they're all drinking from the same well, which is not a bad thing.
going on the other end of things, like there's a role, perhaps,
Yeah.
a good role in the Christian life,
Right.
or this side of things just not within a church setting,
Right.
not on a Sunday morning setting.
Yeah, so I mean, I am strongly in favor of that, and I'm not. I probably sound like I'm against all Christian entertainment. I'm not. There is a lot of it that I like. When I think of examples, it depends on what kind of genre you're talking about. There was for a while, Sufjan Stevens was doing some interesting things. What?
Go back to the 90s when it was all like grunge.
Back to the 90s, yeah.
There were some actually good.
Yeah.
There were some good like punk rock bands who were good, period.
Yeah.
And then they were just good, and they happened to be Christians.
Right.
But they were just good punk bands.
Right. So then some of those guys really knew what they were doing. I mean,
Exactly.
even guys like Rich Mullins, right, who knew a thing or two about how to play instruments. Keith Green, when you get home tonight, look up the Prodigal Son Suite, this glorious 12-minute ballad that tells the whole story of the prodigal son in a musical setting that makes you realize that Keith Green knows exactly what he's doing, like complete with strings and an orchestra and all this crazy stuff. It's incredible.
I think I think what you're pointing to is sometimes Christians devolve into just aping an art
Yes,
form,
imitating,
rather
yeah.
than being we're really good artists,
Right,
and we have a doctrine of vocation.
Right.
Our vocation of artists is
Right.
to the glory of God.
right.
and
Yes,
impacted by our
yes,
theology.
yes.
Like I would say,
And to
Shaolin
be-
is very much like that.
To be fair, you've got accounts from guys like Rich Mullins who wanted to do that and got muzzled by the CCM industry. So like he really was trying to create, but it didn't fit the mold of what his superiors felt would sell. And that was, I think, very discouraging for him. That's why he ended up on a reservation in the middle of New Mexico, wasn't? He ditched all of it for a long while. So yeah.
Did he come back?
I think so, because I think he died while he was on tour, so he must have come back, because he died when he was on the road in a car accident. So I think it was he took like a hiatus and then came back, I believe.
To answer your question, it seems like there's a place for entertainment, and as Christians, we should be at the forefront and
Yeah.
doing it well.
Yeah.
It's the glory of God, not
Yeah.
copying.
Right.
Or copying.
Right.
But the danger, I think, is when we try to bring that into Sunday morning.
Yes.
And we don't have a clear understanding of what Sunday morning is for.
Yeah, because they're
There's a friend we have in Houston had a church, and he walked in, and it was very much the stage. And not only was it a stage, but they put their money and effort into building these huge set pieces. It was like being at a Broadway show.
yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, if you have to have a set piece for every sermon series, what does that mean?
It's a lot of money.
Important to you.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then other mega churches where you had to audition if they were going to let you be on the front to be on the team
Right.
because they wanted professional quality people.
Right. Yeah.
Well,
But
it
what
was,
does that communicate?
Yeah.
So-
but to the other, not just the contemporary churches, because my parents' church, which is First President, Scottsdale, Arizona,
First Church. Yeah.
well, it was, no, Valley Presbyterian, sorry.
Oh, okay,
Valley
yeah.
Presbyterian, not First. But mainstream Presbyterian, they were United Presbyterian when I was there, so.
Mm-hmm.
But their choir,
Yeah.
the director of their choir was the dean of the music department at ASU.
Oh my. Yeah.
Most of the choir were part of the Phoenix Orpheus and the Phoenix
Wow.
choir.
Wow.
And so my mom tried to get on to that choir. And it's when they were getting ready to do the Messiah.
Didn't make the cut.
So, well, no, they
Oh, no.
had the sheet music, and she looked at it and go,
You expect me to sing this? Yeah.
and they went off and started singing, and she just came home with tears.
Oh.
You know, so you can go to the entertainment
Yeah.
to be in the, the symphony side
Yeah.
can also be entertainment.
Yeah.
Just like the rock concert can be entertainment. So we always
Yeah.
have to guard
Yeah.
on both sides.
That's a very good point. It's a very fair point.
When I would even to try to temper the same thing that can happen with a church plant who starts in a theater.
Right.
They can absolutely overcome
Yep.
the challenge.
Yep.
But you got your work cut out for you.
Yep.
Likewise, I would say if you are longing to reach into a particular community,
Mm-hmm.
you may look like a modern mega church. You may have those appearances,
Right.
and God could be using you to impact that culture and change things. And so I don't want to
Yeah.
demonize that and say,
Right.
you need to get pews.
No. Yeah.
No, but here's the deal is recognize the challenge you will face.
Yes. And a good example of this would also be that church that I dearly love, Redeemer Presbyterian in Lynchburg, Virginia. So we were the church plant in the middle school, and then that Episcopal church, funnily enough, like next door to the middle school, closed their doors and moved out, and so we moved right in. And for the first 6 months, really struggled with fellowship. Because you see, before, everybody's showing up an hour early to set up chairs, to get the sound system hooked up, to get the podium thing wheeled in, to get 6 people to bring in a table for the Lord's Supper. And that's your fellowship, man. That was like where all of our fellowship was concentrated, where everybody shows up to set up. Now we get there on Sunday morning and everything is set up, and like we really struggled like to see each other. It's like, well, now what we don't know what to do. And really, that was about the time that I left for Edinburgh, so I'm sure they're still doing fine. But but it was interesting to note that that it actually kind of created a problem that nobody anticipated.
Yeah, and that was actually
So-
in our church, which we were in the school for 5, 6 years, whatever, before we built the building.
Yeah.
I remember about the session time, and it was about a year or so after being in the building,
Mm-hmm.
we finally started to become aware that everybody in church was starting to coast.
Yes.
They'd all been involved, have to do everything, all hands on deck.
Yes.
Now we have the
Yep.
building, so everybody took a breath.
Yep.
Okay, for a little
Yep.
But we had to do something to
Yep.
kind of get that revitalized again.
Right. Right. I think we're probably describing the same. I think the same thing happened at Redeemer as well. Yeah. Yeah. Well, very good. I have since we've kind of reached the end, and so I'm going to go ahead and pray for us. I think let me just say this before, because I've got 4 minutes left, maybe 3 minutes left. That here's what I didn't mean to say, but probably in how I came in too hot. Probably sounded like I was saying they like I'm dissing all kinds of Christian entertainment. I'm not. Here's my thing though, is that there tends to be that the approach to Christian entertainment tends to have what I call a sympathetic edge, which is when people hear that Christians are doing entertainment, they go, oh, like, oh, it's probably not going to be as good. It's, probably going to be kind of low budget, bless them. I'm sure it'll be cute. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'm sure it'll be good. The kids will love it. Right? Whereas like what I would long for and hope for, they would be like, it's Christian. Oh, that means it's going to be good. Oh, that means it's going to be real good. Man, that means it's going to be eminently rewatchable, and we're going to want to listen to it again and again and again, right? Again, we've got the content. We've got literally the best story on the planet to tell in different ways and in different variations. So with that, yeah, that's kind of my hope for Christian entertainment. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this time that you've given us again, and I pray that we'd be mindful of the spaces that we're in. We worship together, as Eddie said, mindful of the challenges, the particular challenges, whatever they might be for us in this moment that we face. And so help us, Lord, to serve you well by being good stewards of this beautiful, beautiful space that you've given us. And grant us grace as we seek to carry on your gospel together far beyond the four walls of this building, into the minds, the hearts, and the mouths of our neighbors who desperately need to know and to love Jesus. And so give us the courage to do just that in Jesus' name. Amen. Closing point that I forgot to mention, I think I might have mentioned it before, but this we've got definitely kind of a pointed arch, so it doesn't quite make the same point. But some churches have more of this curved ceiling going on, and what the idea is supposed to be that the people of God are kept inside the ark of God, right? And so if you take an ark and you flip it upside down, and now that's supposed to be the idea. Not really so much in this particular scheme, but if you see churches that have more of a rounded shape for their roof, that's the idea they're going for. Just kind of a cool idea. That one's free. You didn't pay for that one.